Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 minutes after 11. Let's start with our first COCAS webinar on the upcoming NIS2 regulation. First, a big welcome to you all that you're attending this webinar. We are really happy about that. My name is Henning Braun. I'm part of COCAS since around about 7 years, and my focus is on sales of security services. What is the plan for today? Today, we gather to explore the rules and the regulations of the new NIS2 framework. That means also the impact on cybersecurity and also on digital resilience. Today, we have a main focus on the key components of NIS2. That means we have a deep dive into the scope, the compliance requirements, and also the implications for the organizations operating in a dynamic digital environment. Our speaker today is Nikolai Strasting. Nikolai, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Nikolai will share today his insights and also practical recommendation to support you, to help you to prepare for the complexity of NIS2. And it doesn't matter if you're a security professional or an industry stakeholder or an executive. This webinar aims to support you to prepare for the NIS2 regulation. And I think all of us remember GDPR because we all were involved. And NIS2 has some similarities to GDPR. GDPR was very complex. Many new requirements had to be fulfilled, strong timelines, and definitely also strong end dates to deliver it. And in the end, it was a little bit a stressful process. And when you are prepared for NIS2 in an early phase, helps you that you can avoid last minute rushes. Yes, and that means for my side, perhaps that is a hope, you can sleep much better than at GDPR. And because of this complexity, I think, and I'm also convinced that you have some questions or perhaps you want to discuss some open points, please ask Nikolai. Feel free. You can use the Q&A function below on the screen. You should see. Use it because we have planned some minutes to cover this after the presentation from Nikolai. Then we can clarify how we can support you. One further point I don't want to miss to tell you, we will record this session. That means we have a high focus on the presentation, but your identities will not be included in this presentation, in this recording. Yes. Yes, I think that is all from my side in this phase. Nikolai, it's time to hand over to you. Once again, a warm welcome to you. And I wish you in person an interesting session with Nikolai Strasting. Yeah, Nikolai, it's your stage.
Thank you very much, Henning. Yes, good morning also to all of you and a hearty welcome from my side. I'm honored to present to you today the challenges and tasks presented by the new upcoming NIS2 regulation in today's webinar. Maybe to quickly introduce myself, my name is Nikolai Strasting. I'm the Information Security Officer here at the COCAS AG, and I'm also heading the Cybersecurity Consulting team. As Henning mentioned, I'm pretty sure that the one or the other attendee will have a question to the content I will present later on. Please feel free to post them in the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will come back to this later. So let's get into it. NIS2, 3 letters and a number. So what is it at the end? The number 2 indicates it's the successor of something, and it's indeed the successor of NIS or NIS1, as you can name it now. And it is a cyber security directive of the European Union. The abbreviation stands for Network and Information Systems Security Act, now number 2. And the NIS2 regulation follows the Directive 2016/1148/EU from 2016, which is known now as NIS1, which was here in Germany translated into German law in the course of 2017. So it's now, 5-6 years old. And the whole background of this is that the European Union tried to establish a regulatory framework to ensure that the critical sectors in industries in the European Union are protected against cyber risks and threats from internal, external threat actors, or also externalities like catastrophes, etc. The European Union continues to focus on this. So their ambition is in general to improve the overall security and also the resilience of networks and information systems, especially in critical industries across the EU member states. And for this reason, they conducted a review on the success and the effects of NIS1. And in general, they consider this being a success. So the statement were that NIS was a catalyst for national cybersecurity initiatives across the member states. And they in general also assume that the cyber protection level has raised due to this. But, and this is the big but, they also recognized that there were quite significant differences in the implementation of the regulation. So every member state defined different scopes, different requirements for the regulation, so that we end up here in a patchwork process. And the European Union is convinced that this is definitely something which needs to be fixed because of the cross-border cooperation of industries and also the dependencies which are created by this. So in general, the target for NIS2 is to even lift up the cybersecurity in general, but also to make sure that there is a minimum baseline defined, which is applicable to every EU member state, quite similar to what Henning also mentioned, GDPR, which also defines the minimum baseline for data privacy and data protection here. So what we see here in NIS2 is then in general also a much more descriptive law and quite significantly broadened scope of industries and sectors which fall now under the remit of NIS. And when I prepared for the webinar, I looked up the change law here in Germany for NIS, which was just 8 pages, including all the law changes which had to be established here in Germany to fill NIS1, and the current draft law for the transformation of NIS2 into German law is much longer. So that already is an indicator that NIS2 is becoming much more prescriptive here. NIS2 is not the only initiative by the European Union. It is also mentioned here on this slide, RCE, so the Resilience of Critical Entities Act. We will not dig down too deep in this webinar here today. This is a complementary directive which was also established and approved in the same time frame as NIS2. And RCE is focusing a bit more on availability requirements and on resilience of industries, especially against disasters, natural disasters, for example, while NIS2 is more focusing really on the cybersecurity side of it. Both laws, anyway, have some overlaps when it comes to incident management, to business continuity management, for example, as we can see also later. And both laws also need to be transposed into national law in the same time frame. So it's a directive similar to GDPR, which had to be translated to the Datenschutzgrundverordnung here in Germany. And the same will happen now also with NIS. So what is then the state and the plan for this translation in Germany? And here in April, a first draft law was published by the Ministry of Interior here in Germany with the typical small German law description, NIS2 Umsetzungs- und Cybersicherheitsstärkungsgesetz. So please excuse that I will not use this term too frequently now. In general, the logic of this transformation law is comparable to what happened with NIS1, where not a new law was established, but existing law was adapted. And NIS1 was leading to what is called in Germany the IT-Sicherheitsgesetz, which led to changes and adaptations of the BSI law. And also now NIS2 will mainly be implemented by changes of the BSIG, so the BSI law in Germany. Of course, there are also sector-specific laws like the Telecommunications Law, TKG, or the Energy Industry Act here in Germany, where references specifically to the BSI law will be updated, but the most important changes will be done in the BSIG. The timeline for this is not exactly clear. So as I mentioned, their draft law was published in April. It will now go to the process in the different lawmaking processes here in Germany. There is a deadline, which is October next year, but I think given that the law is already available now in a draft state, we can expect that it will become effective in the course of this year. Which means that maybe already in the next year, the requirements will become applicable to the affected industry. Just one interesting fact. The draft law contains an information about the cost impacts of the implementation of NIS2 in Germany. And the current figures are that the expected annual cost of implementing NIS2 is estimated to 1.65 billion euros per year, and a one-time effort for personal cost and other costs of 1.37 billion euros. So that already indicates that there could be quite some impact on the industry in Germany. Maybe before I switch over to the exact contents of NIS2, just one remark. The law is still in a draft state, and if you look into this draft, you will see that a lot of detailed requirements are outsourced to legal ordinances, so Rechtsverordnungen, which will come at a later stage. I will point to these legal ordinances in the area where this become relevant in the course of the webinar. So what are then the main changes which NIS2 will bring? And I summarized them into these four boxes here. So let's have a deeper look now. The gray box on top will not affect companies or organizations directly in Germany. So it is mainly the attempt of the European Union to strengthen standardization, cooperation, and oversight across the different cybersecurity authorities in the European Union. What you will find in this area, and we will not go down into detail here, are topics like a more coordinated vulnerability disclosure process across the European countries, but also central databases for vulnerabilities or for the management of top-level domains, which will be likely implemented by ENISA, so the European Cybersecurity Authority. You will find here requirements that every country needs to implement a national cybersecurity incidents response team, and that there will be also a coordination across these CSIRTs across the countries. That's a new organization which will be founded called EU Cyclone, standing for European Cyber Crisis Liaison Organization Network. So that will be a network of cyber incident response teams. In general, this also includes the direct requirement for every country to appoint a competent, so-called competent authority for supervising cybersecurity implementation in the country. For Germany, this will be the BSI. And the countries also need to define a national cybersecurity strategy, which is also in line with the targets of the European Union. So this is basically what will happen on the governance, on the governmental authority side. But there will also be changes for companies in each EU member state. And these are the three boxes on the top, on the bottom in white. So there will be an extended scope, meaning that much more companies will be affected by NIS2 directly because of the scope extension, but as we can see also indirectly because of the requirements of NIS2 to the regulated companies. There will be much more prescriptive requirements on what these companies have to do in terms of risk management, prevention measures, but also incident management. And last but not least, there will be a very strict enforcement. And again, here is a similarity to GDPR, as we would see that the logic or the type of penalties which can be applied here to companies failing to implement NIS2 is very, very comparable to GDPR. So then let's dig a bit deeper. Let's start with the big question, am I affected? So who is in scope of NIS2? And this is quite a complex structure, which is defined here by the EU and also then used by the German law. In general, the extension happens in two dimensions. So first of all, the scope in terms of industries is extended. And secondly, also the numbers of companies who were not falling under NIS1 regulation so far because of its size will limit, because now the EU is also considering medium-sized companies as part of the regulated industries. So these are the two big changes in terms of scope. So you can see now companies with more than 50 employees and more than 10 million euro annual revenue already are regulated if they fall into one of the regulated sectors. There are two categories of sectors: the essential sectors, which maps somewhat with the definition of critical infrastructure used in Germany today. But you can see here in orange that a couple of industries have been also added compared to NIS1. Maybe just to go through the digital ones here, because there was not enough room to cover all these abbreviations. So these are internet exchange point providers, DNS server providers, top-level domain providers, data centers, cloud service providers, content delivery networks, and trust service providers, which fall here under the regulation. The differentiation between essential sectors and important sectors will become important by looking at the requirements which are imposed on every of these industries. And it will get a bit more even complicated now, as you will see in the next slide. Maybe before I go over to this, there have been estimations by different analysts done how many more companies will be affected by NIS2 due to the scope change. And these estimations range between 20 to 40,000 companies, which will be now new to the NIS regulation with this law change. So that's quite a massive change. As I mentioned, it gets a bit more complicated. So in German, this is also the way how it is implemented in the German translation draft law. The question, what type of regulation applies to your company, depends on both factors, so on the industry, but also on the company size. And to make it a bit more complex, there is now a third category of sectors, which is the CRITIS, the classical critical infrastructure definition, which was used so far in Germany, which will now be added by the essential entities, so in German besonders wichtige Einrichtungen, and the important entities. So companies can fall into one of these three categories. And then there is also the distinction between medium-sized companies, which are defined as 50 to 249 employees and a revenue of up to 50 million euros, or balance sheet up to 43 million euros, and large enterprises are companies which exceed this limit. And the logic in the law now says there is the category CRITIS, which is more or less unchanged to what we have today, already in the German legislation. And the essential entities will be built by the essential industries from the previous slides, but only the large enterprises, so the larger ones. And then the gray boxes show what else falls into these categories. And by default, every provider or user operator of a critical infrastructure, according to CRITIS, will automatically also become an essential entity. They will be complemented by qualified trust services, TLD registrars, DNS service providers, providers of public telco networks and services, and some central government institutions, like, for example, the federal ministries in Germany and the Kanzleramt here in Germany. For the important entities, then this group will be built by the essential sectors, which fall under the category of medium-sized companies. It covers all the important entities of both sizes, as well as trust services, defense industry, and so-called Störfallbetriebe, so plants which have the threat of environmental hazards. So the latter two, they have been regulated also before in the BSI law. They were known as Unternehmen von besonderem Interesse, so UBI, and here the category 1 and 3. So they will in the future be an important or wichtige Einrichtung. So this distinction is relevant because the different categories have different requirements. And this is basically summarized here on this slide. So if you're in scope, then there are 6 building blocks of legal regulations which become relevant for you as a company. So the first one is the risk management measures. These are the cybersecurity means which have to be implemented by the company. We will come to the details on the next slide, which are here in the future regulated in paragraph 30 for the BSI law. They have to be fulfilled by every category of the categorization here. The law just mentions that critical infrastructure needs to fulfill them on a higher standard. What this exactly means is not clear yet, but there is already a paragraph here which is claiming that. On top of implementing these measures, there are reporting obligations. So in case there is an incident, we will see this later on, companies are obliged to report these to authorities within a time frame. The whole process starts with the registration. So if you are affected by NIS2 due to the definitions, you are actively obliged to report to the BSI in Germany that you are, for example, an essential facility or an operator of a critical infrastructure. There is the burden of proof, which basically means that the implementation of especially the risk management measures must be audited by an independent party, and the audit reports need to be provided to the BSI. There are information obligations. If you have an incident, in some cases, you need to inform also the customers, for example. And what is quite important is that the law is making the senior leadership team of an essential important facility or CRITIS operator personally liable for implementing of the NIS2 requirements. So there is one paragraph which is definitely putting or emphasizing this aspect, and also, for example, requires that the senior management, so the directors level, must get a training on cybersecurity aspects related here to NIS2. And now, what is the big difference between the categories? As you can see, the essential facilities, they need to cover all, and the important facilities, they are a bit more relaxed because they don't need to go through the external audit process. They just need to implement it, but they will not be so closely monitored here by requiring an external audit. And the critical facilities, so the CRITIS environments, they have 2 special aspects. So they need to fulfill higher standards in terms of risk management measures. And they have certain special measures which only apply to them. And this is mainly the requirement to implement systems for detection and incident management of threats, so threat detection, attack detection framework, which was also implemented in the latest update of the BSI law in the last year. You see here implicitly as essential facility. So basically, essential facilities are providers or operators of critical infrastructure, which means that if you're operating a critical infrastructure, you're automatically becoming an essential facility. So this is implicitly then also required for these type of organizations. Now let's get a bit deeper into the different requirements here. So the risk management measures is a set of, I would say, best practices in the area of information security and cybersecurity management. But they have been now defined also in NIS2 as a minimum security baseline, which the important essential entities need to implement according to NIS2. And the technical and organizational measures which are meant here, they are in the NIS2 regulation in Article 20 and 21. It's in the new BSI law, it's the paragraph 30. Which will regulate this. And as you can see here, these are typical controls which also are covered by information security standards like, for example, ISO 27001. So companies need to implement policies and guidelines for risk management in information security, which could be equivalent to implementing an ISMS. You need to have incident management procedures to prevent, detect, and manage incidents. There must be a business continuity management implemented. Supply chain security must be managed. We will see on the next slide to a much deeper extent. Also, the acquisition or the development of network and information systems must be now thoroughly managed from an information security perspective. There must be checks for the effectiveness of the implementations by, for example, measuring this and then implementing KPIs. There is a list of cybersecurity hygiene things which need to be implemented, password guidelines, for example, and also trainings, awareness trainings. Cryptography must be regulated going forward. Companies need to make sure that human resources security is properly implemented. Asset management is required. Authentication, so the multi-factor authentication will be seen here as something which is best practice and a minimum security requirement. You need to make sure that communications is secured, and for the case of an emergency, there must be an emergency communication channel available. So this is on a very high level what these two paragraphs are including. The details of this will likely be defined by the EU and or the German government in guidelines or in addendums to the law. So there is rumor that in October 2024, the EU or the ENISA will define something like an implementation standard, but also from the BSI, the similar documents like now the guideline for implementation of the paragraph 8A from the BSI law can be expected, which will have then more details regarding the implementation of this. It's maybe important just to note that this all hazards approach here. So also NIS2 is including physical hazards here, for example, which also explains why, for example, business continuity management is included, where physical hazards like fire, nature disasters play, of course, an important role. So I mentioned before that supply chain security is somewhat emphasized in NIS2. So there are at least these four aspects here which are part of the NIS2 regulation. And the reason for this is that the EU considers the supply chain as a weak spot of operators of importance or of critical infrastructure. Just remember incidents raised by SolarWinds or Kaseya, where suppliers of quite important companies were affected by third-party software introduced with backdoors or vulnerabilities. And this risk is now considered by the EU in these four paragraphs of NIS2. So basically, what you can see here is that NIS2 will demand that cyber supply chain security in terms of the direct suppliers and service providers related to IT infrastructure must be now actively managed by the impacted companies. The same applies to processes regarding system acquisition, development, and maintenance, including that you need to organize the vulnerability disclosure with these partners. So this is also now one aspect of NIS2. In order to facilitate this, especially for the smaller entities which are now affected, the European Union will pick out certain critical supply chains and create a union-level coordinated security risk assessment for these supply chains. I think one example which goes into this direction was the way how the 5G network infrastructure was dealt by the European Union, where certain components of the 5G networks were defined as critical, and now specific requirements apply. And last but not least, for certain as critical or particularly critical ICT products, services, or processes defined objects, the European Union may require that the essential and important entities only use certified products. So this means that suppliers of these type of products will be facing requirements to get certified. And this again fits quite nicely to another initiative on the European Union level. So there's the so-called EU Cyber Resilience Act, which is defined in parallel now, which is obliging providers of digital or products with digital elements to build development and maintenance processes for their products in line with certain requirements and even certification requirements at the end of the day. So this will, of course, also be translated into German law. I think we don't need to go to the exact wording of it. Basically, it means that if you are affected by NIS2, you must make sure that whatever you buy as IT equipment is having a managed risk level and a good enough cybersecurity level. So you need to check also the cybersecurity practices of your direct suppliers and IT service providers. So make sure that whoever is delivering services or IT infrastructure to you does not break the security level of your own organization. And this, of course, also brings another effect. If companies are not directly affected by NIS2 regulation, now going forward, suppliers of such companies will be facing much more cybersecurity scrutiny as the pressure for implementing cybersecurity requirements will be pushed downwards to the supply chain. COCOS, for example, we already saw this in the last year where the automotive industry was also trying to secure the supply chain. So we were asked to get TISAX certified, which was quite some effort for a mid-sized company like COCOS, but we finally managed this at the end of the day. And this will happen now to more and more suppliers also of other industries. So just in case something still goes wrong, and I think everybody who's working in cybersecurity knows that there is nothing like perfect security. So if things go wrong, then companies in scope, they will have reporting obligations. So essential and important entities are then obliged to report what is called a significant incident with undue delay. And this undue delay is translated into less than 24 hours for an early warning, which will be sent then to the BSI in Germany. And this also needs to be done if the incident is not yet confirmed. So if it's enough that there is just a suspicion of a significant incident or any illegal malicious activity, especially if there is a potential cross-border impact. The company then has 72 hours to dig in deeper into this incident and to update the early warning by providing an initial assessment where things like the severity, the impact is already outlined so that also the authorities get a better picture, and on their side then can also follow up with warning, for example, authorities in other countries. The final report, which is then really the detailed investigation of this incident with root cause analysis, detailed impact analysis, and also derived mitigation measures, that needs to be available in less than 1 month after the incident. Significant incident by this is defined as something which is impacting severe disruption of the operational processes of the company, or could lead to a high financial loss, or is the second part here of the definition is potentially affecting other natural or legal persons and causing potentially considerable damage to these authorities. This is, of course, important for critical infrastructure, because if the electricity grid is down, then a lot of external stakeholders are affected, and this will then automatically be a significant incident. So what happens if we just ignore this? And this is where the next similarity to GDPR comes into play. So first of all, there will be quite significant fines. And what you can see on the right side here of this slide, the scheme is basically like in GDPR. So the fine for a major violation of the NIS2 regulation can lead up to a fine of 10 million euro or 2% of the worldwide annual revenue service for essential service providers, whatever is higher of these two numbers. And for important service providers, it's still 7 million euros or 1.4% of the worldwide revenue, whatever is higher. So the same logic, I think it's even the same numbers, like 10 million and 2% for GDPR. And I think everybody knows that data protection authorities have started to use these frameworks for fines, as we can see in the latest fines which were given to social media companies in the US here, for example. It is also important that the executive bodies of the companies are personally liable for this. So they cannot just delegate it. They can, of course, use their CISOs or other security teams to support them in the concrete implementation, but they cannot delegate the liability for this one. Also, the sanction scheme sees the same or similar options for intervention by authorities. So in worst case, also the authorities can ask to stop operations of a company in case everything becomes too non-compliant here. So the last slide for explaining NIS2, when does this all come to be effective? When do I need to report what? So basically what you can see, the registration obligations, this means what is the point in time when I need to write the letter or send the request to the BSI. That is unchanged for critical infrastructure, which means that if you identify that your facility is in definition of the critical infrastructure, then the notification or the registration obligation becomes effective on the next day. For essential and important facilities, it's a bit more relaxed, so there is 3 months time after this was identified. The big question, of course, is when do I need to book the audit company to get the audit report to fulfill the burden of proof. And this will not change for CRITIS because it is already in place today. And for the part which is new for CRITIS, that will be then covered by the regulation on the essential facilities. And the current implementation law for Germany says that the set when companies need to report the audit for the first time will be between 2 and 3 years after the law becomes effective. So looking into the calendar, this means we will most likely talk about some point in time in 2025 or 26. And then after this, if the law becomes effective the first time, then the BSI will tell new registered companies after this starting point when the first audit is expected by the BSI, and then all companies need to follow up 2 years after the last audit. So you see that there is a lot of change coming up, but there are also still some question marks. And as mentioned in the beginning, a lot of detailed definitions are outsourced to this Rechtsverordnungen, so legal ordinances. And there are a couple of legal ordinances outlined. So for example, the exact definition, what determines a critical facility, so that you can say, well, yeah, I'm for sure one of the essential entities or one of the important entities. So for CRITIS, there is already today a Rechtsverordnung which defines what exact facilities in a company are considered to be critical infrastructure, and they even then have these threshold values where you need to meet a certain volume of served customers or served goods in order to become CRITIS. So this is something which will still happen, which will still come. But anyway, as you can see, implementation of the risk management measures is quite a huge catalog, and knowing from our TISAX certification, it takes some time to implement these measures if they are not in place yet. So the big question is, what can companies do already now? And from our perspective, we see 5 points which can be tackled already now. So the first thing is that every organization should monitor and clarify if NIS2 is impacting its own organization. So see if the sectors which are defined also in the implementation law meets whatever your operations are. Also, if you are not impacted, have a review of your customer base and see if most of your customer base will now be NIS regulated in the future. Then you should also probably prepare to get much more Excel sheets or requests for vendor qualification going forward. Now, if you say, yes, I think there is something coming up here, then you should do an asset or a gap analysis. So just have a view, where am I in terms of what is written already in or known already from the draft law. Of course, you should make sure that your cyber risk management is set up and running, because that will be essential also for the implementation. And the earlier you start with this, also, for example, starting to qualify your direct suppliers and to manage the supply chain risks, the less stressful the implementation will be at the end. Business continuity is a big topic, not only from NIS, but also from the RCE perspective. I think if you are an essential or important entity, this is most likely anyway a topic already, but you should also have a look if you already have ideas how to cooperate with the centralized incident response teams. And last but not least, as we saw, the reporting requirements for incidents are quite tight. You should consider to implement or improve the incident detection and response capabilities in your organization by, for example, implement a SIEM system. Why is this important? Just as one quick example, a SIEM system will help you in case there is an incident to get a better understanding what exactly has happened, because it's the single truth of knowledge in the organization where all the different log files and machine data comes together so that you get a good picture of the incident quite early, and this will not put more stress on your analysts, security analysts, in case of an incident, because they need to fight the incident and report in the future now to the authorities. And if this is facilitated by systems like SIEM, this will be a great help going forward. Now, my last slide before we go to the Q&A section, it's the usual commercial break. We as COCOS offer cybersecurity services, and we would be very happy to support you in the one or the other area. Just to outline a bit where we can help you here in terms of the scope of NIS2. The more important stuff regarding this topic is found here on the right side and in the middle. So we are supporting services in the area of implementation of information security measures of organizational nature, but also technical nature. So we are, for example, providing Cybersicherheitschecks according to the Alliance for Cybersecurity in Germany. We are helping to implement and define policies, and also help to provide awareness and training to your staff. In terms of cybersecurity risk management, we are helping not only to implement setting up risk management methodologies, doing baseline risk assessment, but also introducing GRC tools, which facilitate management of risk quite significantly. And also we are helping in the area of cyber defense and security operations by, for example, facilitating the implementation of SIEM systems, improving SOCs by SOC automation or extending data sources. And also we are quite active in the area of vulnerability management. Just to finish this off, the left side, security consulting and security by design. If you need a security architect or somebody who is acting as a security Spock in your development process, this is also what we are doing in COCOS. So that is complementing then our security portfolio here. If you need support, we would be very happy if you would reach out here to us. So this gives us the 10 minutes of Q&A time. So Henning, did we get some
we have
questions?
Received some questions. The first question to you is, are there any exceptions for companies?
Well, exceptions, yeah, you saw that the framework is quite cluttered. Of course, if you are a company which is not working in any of these sectors and which is less size than the medium company size here, then you are not directly affected. There's only one really known exception, which is also mentioned in the law, which are companies who are relevant for the national security. So this could be, for example, criminal enforcement units in Germany or organizations close to defense. They are accepted from the law, but the law still states that they need to provide a comparable level of cybersecurity. So basically, if you are in scope in terms of the sector and of the company size, then there are no real other exceptions than this.
Thank you, Nikolai. The next question. We are a postal and courier company, which means we belong to Annex 2, important sectors. This does not change if we are a larger company, correct?
That is correct. So the Annex 2, the important sectors, is independent of size, just an important entity.
When will details for the requirements for Germany be available?
That is not entirely clear, to be honest. I think some of the details need to be there earlier, like for example the definition what builds or what is considered to be a critical facility, for example. I think there is also a lot of material already available from the previous CRITIS laws. All I can say here is that the deadline for implementation of NIS2 is October of next year. So I would say latest by this date, the details must be there, but I have no information when the other legal ordinances will be available.
Okay, Nikolai, thank you. I think from my perspective, the next two questions belongs together. They are quite similar. The question is there any security standard which covers the requirements for NIS2? And the other user is asking special for ISO 27001.
Yes. As the details are missing, that cannot be answered with full security here, or with this full convincing, because there might be special aspects of it. So in general, if we look at the catalog of risk management measures which are in the law, then I would say it should roughly match. And the European Union in the NIS law is also emphasizing that they want to orient to international known laws. So it is very likely that if, for example, a certification would be required, that ISO 27001 is at least covering to a large extent the requirements of NIS2. And there are some specific aspects. So I don't know if you remember this slide, there was the requirement to have an emergency communication channel. To my knowledge, this is quite a detailed requirement already, which is not really to this detail part of ISO 27001. So these type of requirements could maybe be something which are missing. So if you're an ISO 27001 certified company, you might not have these emergency communication channel according to the requirements available. So short answer, I think if you are ISO 27001 certified or TISAX certified or BSI Grundschutz certified, then it's already a good bet that you will not become too stressed when NIS2 becomes effective. But as mentioned, maybe some detailed work needs to be refined.
Thank you, Nikolai. One participant has raised their hand. We are sorry, you can't speak. Therefore, please use the Q&A function to ask questions. It's not possible to speak to each other in this case. Or is it possible, Nikolai? No.
No.
No. So please use the Q&A session function if it's possible and ask the questions, and we can try to answer this now. But when there is no open question, we are finished with the Q&A session and with the complete webinar NIS2 from COCAS. Nikolai, do you want to give a final information to the audience, or should I finish the?
No, I just would like to thank the audience. As mentioned, if you have any more questions also after this webinar, feel free to contact us. So we are happy to step into the discussion with you.
Yes, also from my side, many thanks for your participation and for your interest into this webinar. And yes, if there are any questions, as mentioned from Nikolai, please feel free, contact us, and yes, enjoy the day and have a good, successful week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.